Part 2.
Glen McCurley strangled Carla Walker in 1974. Was she his only victim?
Then the passenger door flew open. Rodney would later say that he caught a glimpse of a tall man with short brown hair. The assailant was wearing a vest. He began bludgeoning Rodney over the head with the butt of a pistol. At some point, the gun's magazine clip dislodged and fell to the parking lot. The man grabbed Carla. Rodney, barely conscious, heard him say, "You're coming with me, aren't you, sweetie?" "Rodney, go get my dad," Carla said. "Go get my dad." Rodney came to in the driver's seat sometime around 1 a.m. He sped to the Walkers' home, which was less than a mile away. He drove up over the curb onto the front lawn and slammed on the brakes. Carla's parents, Leighton and Doris, were still awake, playing dominoes in the dining room with relatives. Carla's little brother Jim, who was 12 years old, and her elder sister, Cindy, who was 18, were in the living room, watching television. They heard someone banging at the front door and were stunned to see Rodney, blood dripping down his face. He was frantic. "Mr. Walker, they've got her," he shouted. "They're gonna hurt her bad." Leighton, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, grabbed his pistol and raced to the bowling alley. Doris dialed the operator on the family's rotary phone and asked to be connected to the police. Officers soon arrived at the scene. Searching the parking lot, they found Carla's purse along with the magazine clip that had been ejected from the assailant's weapon. Other cops drove the surrounding streets in squad cars, scanning for any sign of Carla. After the sun rose, more joined the hunt. Peering through binoculars, a few circled the city in helicopters. When classes resumed on Monday morning, detectives visited Western Hills High. They studied contact sheets of photos taken at the dance, looking for anyone who seemed out of place. They stopped kids in the hallways, asking if they knew anyone who would want to hurt Carla. In the early 70s, Fort Worth's population was roughly 400,000, less than half its size today. Local boosters promoted the city as a safe, family-oriented haven. "In our neighborhood, people didn't even lock their doors," Carla's sister, Cindy, told me. "I know this sounds strange, but we were so naive about crime back then that we simply couldn't imagine that Carla was dead. We figured that someone was going to drive by the house and drop Carla off, and we'd all move on from there." But on February 20th, 4 days after Carla's disappearance, two of the officers assigned to look for her were driving along a remote 2-lane road near Benbrook Lake, about 5 miles southwest of the bowling alley. They spotted a culvert, a concrete tunnel built to let water flow beneath the road, and pulled over to peer inside. They saw a young woman lying on her back, her face and neck covered with scratches and deep bruises. It was Carla. Her blue dress was bloody and ripped in several places, her bra was pushed up above her breasts, and her underwear and pantyhose were wadded up together at the entrance to the culvert. She had been strangled. Because there were no ligature marks around her neck, investigators believed that the killer had choked her using his hands. Carla's parents were asked to come to the hospital morgue to identify her. Jim went with them. "Someone took Mom and Dad down the hall to look at her, and my mom started to scream," he told me. "I had never heard anyone make a sound like that. It was like an animal sound. That will stay with me for as long as I live." News of Carla's murder covered almost the entire front page of the Star-Telegram. Her funeral, which was held at the Western Hills Church of Christ, was attended by more than 1,250 mourners. far more than the small sanctuary could hold. As they walked past Carla's open casket, her friends were overcome with grief. They were also terrified. They stopped cruising up and down Camp Bowie Boulevard after school, and some would no longer leave their houses at night. Kathy O'Neill, the editor of the high school yearbook that year, babysat in the neighborhood. She had to call her parents the moment she arrived, to let them know she was safe. Others signed up for self-defense classes that were arranged by the Western Hills High PTA and taught by two men who held black belts in jiu-jitsu. Fort Worth officials formed a task force of detectives from area police departments. But the group didn't have much to investigate. No fingerprints had been identified on Carla's body or clothing. The blood on her dress had come from Rodney's head wounds. Traces of bodily fluid had been found, but the technology did not yet exist to identify a person from their DNA. In that era, there were no surveillance cameras in parking lots, no license plate readers on the sides of highways. We didn't even have computers in our police departments, Jim Minter, one of the task force detectives, told me. The group did set up a 24-hour telephone tip line. At the downtown police headquarters, officers sat behind metal desks sipping lukewarm coffee and listening to citizens pass on the names of men they believed had killed Carla. The detectives were told by various callers that Carla had been murdered by a pair of marijuana dealers, by a carnival worker at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo, and by a quiet young man who often bowled alone at the alley where Carla had been kidnapped. They heard stories about a boy who had supposedly gotten into an argument with Rodney at Mr. Quick Hamburger's the night before the dance. They also got a call from a man who wouldn't give his name. He claimed he knew the murderer, who he said hadn't meant to kill Carla and had only wanted to F her. The detectives also hired a hypnotist to try to draw more details out of Rodney, who suffered a head injury during the incident. But the most significant memory he managed to recall was that Carla's kidnapper had been wearing a brown or tan cowboy hat. When the hypnotist snapped his fingers and Rodney awoke, the boy burst into tears, a scared kid, all torn up inside, tormented that he didn't do enough to save his girlfriend, Minter recalled. During one meeting, the task force detectives did discuss another unsolved murder that had taken place on February 7, 1973, almost exactly a year before Carla's. That night, a young woman named Becky Martin didn't return home after attending a night class at Tarrant County Junior College's South Campus. Her body was found almost 7 weeks later. It was so decomposed that there was no way to determine the cause of death. The medical examiner said Martin could have been stabbed or strangled or even shot through the stomach. But what most intrigued the detectives about Martin's murder was where her body had been found, in a culvert just outside the city limits. 2 dead girls in 2 culverts, a year apart. It just seemed too coincidental, said Minter. Although they said nothing publicly, the investigators began looking for a serial killer. By March, a month after Carla's killing, all the task force had to go on was one small lead. The detectives learned that the magazine clip found in the bowling alley parking lot belonged to a newer model .22 Ruger handgun. They asked the federal government's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms to provide them the names of anyone living in Fort Worth who had purchased that model. The ATF came up with a list of a couple dozen people, and the task force set out to interview each of them. One man on the list was a 31-year-old truck driver named Glen McCurley. He was raised in West Texas, the eldest of 3 boys. His father, Glen McCurley Sr., served with the Army in World War II and later became an insurance adjuster. According to one person who knew the family, Glen Sr. was proud of his two younger sons, who were athletes and good students, but thought McCurley was undisciplined and a troublemaker. When McCurley was a teenager, his parents sent him to the Westview Boys' Home, in southwestern Oklahoma. Westview, which is sponsored by the Churches of Christ, promotes itself as a place for those who are deprived due to sickness or death in their family, boys experiencing significant problems in living with their family, boys needing supervision, runaways or truants, delinquent boys, those who have violated the law but who are not in need of treatment or detention, and abandoned, abused or neglected boys. It's not clear why McCurley was sent to the home or precisely how long he was there, but his stay clearly wasn't transformative. By February 1961, he left Westview and was in Abilene, where he stole a car. Then he abandoned that car and stole another one. The State Highway Patrol began to pursue him and shot out one of his tires. He drove the vehicle onto a vacant lot and attempted to escape on foot but was quickly captured. Youth accused of auto theft. Here was the headline in the next day's Abilene Reporter-News.
In court, McCurley pleaded guilty and received a 2-year sentence. He was released early, in the spring of 1962, when he was 19, and eventually moved to Midland, where he met a blonde high school student named Judy Watson. The daughter of an oil field worker, she was an earnest student and a member of the Business Education Club. According to someone who knew her, she was a good girl who hadn't dated much. McCurley captivated her. He was a big guy, with close-cropped brown hair, dark brown eyes, Johnny Cash sideburns, and an endearing dimpled grin. On February 16, 1963, McCurley married Judy in a Baptist church. At the reception, a photographer snapped a picture of them cutting the cake. The young couple moved into a small rental home. McCurley eventually got a job as a truck driver for the U.S. Postal Service, with a route to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Judy gave birth to 2 sons, Craig and Roddy. Then, in 1972, McCurley moved his young family to a neighborhood in West Fort Worth. McCurley and Judy enrolled their boys in the public elementary school, and they joined Ridgely West Baptist Church. McCurley got another truck driving job, hauling prefabricated slabs of concrete to construction sites. Judy worked at their church's daycare center. Parents at the center loved Judy. She was affectionate with the children. Warm and motherly, one of the parents told me. McCurley wasn't as personable as his wife, but he maintained a good reputation. In his free time, he dropped by Ridgely West Baptist to mow the lawn and make any needed repairs around the church. He performed odd jobs for his neighbors, tinkering with their car engines and replacing faulty electrical wiring in their homes. One man who knew McCurley did note a distasteful habit. He'd see a pretty girl and say something like, "Take a look at that," he told me. But he never said anything vulgar about her, at least not to me. He wasn't, creepy. In early March 1974, 2 detectives arrived at McCurley's home to interview him about his Ruger .22 pistol. When the officers asked about the gun, McCurley said it had been stolen 6 weeks earlier from his pickup truck while he was fishing. He then agreed to come downtown and take a polygraph test, which he passed. The task force promptly eliminated him as a potential suspect. As much as it pains me to say this, we didn't think about McCurley again, Minter told me. While at spring 1974, investigators still had little to show for their work. The task force didn't officially disband, but many of the detectives were ordered by their supervisors to return to their other cases. Meanwhile, at Western Hills High, students raised money to pay for a memorial to Carla, a tile plaque of a cougar, the school's mascot, which administrators installed on the floor of the front hallway. Black ropes hanging from metal stanchions surrounded the plaque so that no one could walk on it. We wanted to make sure Carla was never forgotten. Connie Carnes Myers, Carla's close friend since childhood, told me. Our hope was to create a place where everyone could come and remember just what kind of special person Carla was. In the spring of 1975, those classmates graduated. By fall 1976, when Carla's little brother Jim arrived at Western Hills High for his freshman year, Carla's name wasn't mentioned in the hallways like it once was. Students chatted happily to one another as they walked past her memorial. Jim tried to avoid the plaque. A personable kid with thick brown hair that fell over his ears, he wanted to move on with his life. Still, there were times he would come across Carla's memorial and feel overwhelmed. Our family had been destroyed by Carla's murder, Jim told me. Every morning, my mom would slip back to her bathroom, stand in the shower without the water running, and weep. I never saw my dad cry. He was a military man, you know, but for the first few years after Carla's murder, I didn't see him smile either. During those years, strangers would occasionally call the Walker's house, many of them anonymously, claiming they had information about Carla's killer. Leighton talked to all of them. He took notes and kept them in a metal box the size of a cigar box, said Jim. He wrote down names and addresses of potential suspects, and he drew circles on maps where he had been told the killer lived. He was not going to rest, he told me, until he knew Carla's killer was behind bars. When Jim turned 16 and got his driver's license, he began spending his free time helping his dad hunt for the killer. Sometimes, on the anniversary of Carla's death, he would prowl the parking lot of the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl, looking for anyone suspicious. Jim took boxing lessons at the Panther Boys Club, joined the high school's wrestling and football teams, and went on long runs through his neighborhood. I wanted to be ready in case I ever came across the killer, Jim said. My plan was to overpower him and take him someplace far away. Maybe somewhere out in West Texas, where no one could hear him scream. Jim would occasionally jog down Vickery Boulevard, past a street called Mark's Place. On that street, in a small, tan, one-story house, lived Glen McCurley and his family. Jim had no idea who the McCurleys were. He'd never even met the family's eldest son, Craig, who was 2 years behind him at Western Hills High. Who knows? Jim said. Maybe our families stood in the same line at the grocery store. Or we pulled up to the same traffic light on Camp Bowie Boulevard. Or we sat next to one another at Pulido's. Every year, we had a big family garage sale, which brought out a lot of people in the neighborhood. I've always thought Glen McCurley might have stopped at one of our garage sales. If the two had met, it's doubtful McCurley would have triggered any alarms. When he wasn't on the road for his job, McCurley built and sold picnic tables, barbecue pits, and firewood stands. He and Judy seemed to enjoy a healthy marriage. A man who was friends with Craig told me that Craig's dad never said or did anything that I thought was in any way inappropriate. To me, Mr. McCurley was just another dad in the neighborhood. On February 19, 1977, Almost precisely 3 years after Carla's body was found, someone came across the body of 25-year-old June Ward, a vocational nurse, lying next to a curb in South Fort Worth. Ward was naked except for a bra strap wrapped around her neck. She had been strangled and beaten over the head with what one reporter described as a sharp, heavy object. Detectives who had worked on the Carla Walker task force couldn't help but notice the similarities between the two crimes. And then, on July 9, 1980, the body of a 19-year-old woman named Denise Huff, described in the newspapers as an unemployed drifter, was found a few feet from a creek bridge in southeast Fort Worth. She too had been strangled,